Good morning. If you're just coming in, feel free to quickly grab a coffee and take your seats. Thank you all for coming today to the grand opening of Perry Worldhouse. Thank you particularly for braving the elements this morning. I can promise you an extraordinary 2 days of programming that hopefully will make up for the weather, and I've been told that sunshine is expected at some point later in the day. If you picked up the paper this morning, read the news on your phone on the way in, or perhaps listened to the radio on the drive today, then you know why Perry Worldhouse is so necessary and so important to the University of Pennsylvania. Climate change is real and happening, affecting countries all over the globe. The spread of Zika is yet another global health crisis. Russia is becoming more aggressive in its neighborhood and in the new battlefield of cyberspace. Today we have cars that can drive themselves, and any kid with a remote control can operate a drone. It will be extremely difficult to even anticipate the economic, social, and cultural implications of the budding fourth industrial revolution. Elsewhere, millions of refugees are still desperately trying to get to Europe, and those already there are trying to learn how to adapt to their new countries and their countries to them. As China makes louder noises in the South China Sea, North Korea is testing new nuclear weapons. And of course, in New York and Minneapolis this weekend, we saw the horrible effects of terror, whether homegrown or international. The list goes on and on. We collectively stand at a moment of profound challenge and change. Yet what you have also heard over the past few months in our national discourse is a political arena driven by ideology and partisanship. And that is exactly why Perry Worldhouse has been established as a global policy research center that aims to advance interdisciplinary, policy-relevant research around the world's most pressing global challenges. Perry Worldhouse will draw together the knowledge and expertise found at all 12 of Penn's extraordinary schools and its countless centers and programs, connecting Penn with policymakers, practitioners, and researchers from around the world to develop and advance innovative policy proposals. And we are very fortunate to have many of those experts joining us today and tomorrow for our grand opening. And this extraordinary building. It is also very important both as a structure and as home to Perry Worldhouse. Its architecture sends a signal about how important global engagement is to Penn. It will literally serve as a hub, an open space of visible lines connecting all of Penn and Penn to the global policy world. It is here that we will convene global world leaders, cutting-edge practitioners, and top thinkers to talk with each other, with scholars and students here at Penn. There is so much that Perry Worldhouse wants to do and can do because of the vitality, creativity, and intelligence of the Penn community, many of whom I see in this room. And this building will be a place for them to come together, for students and student groups and faculty, where we can create the content that we need and the ideas that can make Penn a global agenda setter. To begin with our events today and tomorrow, we begin that with our events today and tomorrow, and I want to now invite you back tomorrow, particularly tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock for a keynote dedication program with Secretary Robert Gates. There's still space to register if you'd like to, across the street at the Annenberg Auditorium. But to get things started this morning, allow me to introduce the Vice Provost for Global Affairs, Dr. Zeke Emanuel. Zeke has been an extraordinary partner in creating Perry Worldhouse, the original visionary behind it. He is also an extraordinary scholar in his own right as the Diane and Robert Levy University Professor and Chair of the Department of Medical Ethics here at Penn. Beyond that, though, he is exemplary of the kind of connection between academe and policy that Perry Worldhouse will establish, having served as special advisor on health policy to the director of the Office of Management and Budget and been a visionary of America's healthcare reform. It's with great thanks I give you Zeke Emanuel.
Thank you, Bill, for that lovely introduction. And I want to say, if you're standing back there, come in. There are seats available. It's going to be a very full morning. We stand in this amazingly beautiful building, Perry World House, and I want to personally thank Richard and Lisa Perry, whom I've worked with for the last 4 years to make this a reality. I want to thank them for their wonderful generosity. But anyone who knows the Perrys knows that their generosity is the least of their contribution to this magnificent building. Their vision, their thoughtfulness, their support goes well beyond the funding of a building. They recognized the need to have a building dedicated to global affairs at Penn, and they established it. They helped secure the architects that would render a stunning design for this building. And they insisted that the building display great art of world renown. And anyone who knows the Perrys knows that they make suggestions, but they do not make demands or commands. They are quite generous both with their ideas and with their purse. But in each of these three ways, they have created a building that is not just functional, but both embodies and symbolizes Penn's commitment to global activities in many different ways. First, the Perry World House building itself is an instantaneous landmark on the Penn campus. It's in the heart of the campus, and it sends a message throughout the Penn community about our global engagement. Now, it's true that Penn has been engaged in the world throughout its history. As some of my staff like to note, the Penn Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology is in some ways the original global commitment of Penn. But that engagement until the last 5 years, was haphazard and inconsistent. Let me just give you one example. In 1980, less than 1% of the undergraduate student body here at Penn in all 4 schools came from outside the United States. Today, 15%. 5 years ago, President Gutmann, Provost Price, and the Penn leadership sought to give more coherence and centrality to our global activities at Penn. They created Penn Global, and my position as the Vice Provost, and committed the university to engaging with the world as a central part of its mission. Perry World House, centered in the campus, with this beautiful landmark building that will attract students, faculty, and the community, made clear to everyone that global is, in fact, central to the mission of Penn in the future. I want to stress there to the university, unlike many other Penn buildings, actually all of them, Perry World House is not owned by one school or another. It's a university building with a stated mission to bring the entire university, all 12 schools, together. And that is quite unique in the Penn tradition. So we have a central landmark here. But beyond that, just the internal architecture of this building symbolizes the various activities that will take place here and the vision for Perry World House. The first pillar of Penn's global strategic plan focused on engaging students in global affairs. The spaces and the rooms on this first floor invite students, as well as faculty, administrators, and the larger Philadelphia community, to engage in thinking and discussing about global affairs and activities, to hear lectures, panels, discussions of current events about the world. This beautiful forum, the lounge, the classroom, all of them are areas, as Bill said, for convening and bringing people together to discuss, examine, and critically engage with the world. That is the first floor. The second floor is for the think tank that will enable Penn to make a real, relevant, and timely contribution and impact on world events. It is what we said in the Global Strategic Plan to make Penn more of an agenda setter on the world stage. It's on the second floor that there are quiet, sun-filled offices for hard thinking and writing, as well as an inviting common room, common space that beckons people to come together to talk, to collaborate, to generate new ideas through their collaboration. We imagine policymakers, scholars, people from all 12 schools coming together to think anew about the future of the world. Finally, let me say that Richard and Lisa Perry recognize that engaging the world is not just about ideas, panel discussions, and lectures. It happens also through culture and art and performance, and they understand this critically and viscerally. From the very start, they insisted that Perry World House be a home to world-renowned art, that it be designed to create spaces to display art that will lift the soul and make people think about global activities differently. And the Perry World House, through art as well as lectures and discussions, will also engage the world. So it's not just a beautiful building, there's beauty in the building with the art that has beautifully been installed for you to contemplate. Having worked on this building for the last 4 years, from its twinkle in Richard and Lisa Perry's eye to its actual embodiment, realization, and opening today and tomorrow, I could not be more excited by the prospects of this landmark on Penn's campus, bringing together everybody at Penn to think about global activities. I want to thank Richard and Lisa Perry for having the vision to make this building happen. And I want to say that Penn is extremely lucky to have Bill Burke-White to be the director of Perry World House and to lead and orchestrate all the activities that are going to happen in here with his tremendous energy, tremendous sense of collaboration, and tremendous sense of the role of Perry World House in the larger Penn, but also global community, is critical to making it a success. So with that, I want to thank you for coming. We have a very, very engaging and I think quite exciting day of ideas today, and tomorrow a quite exciting day of a little more pomp and circumstance to open the building. But it is a wonderful fulfillment of 4 years and a very, very strong promise to the future of making global activities central to Penn and central to the Penn campus. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to your participation in the next panel.
Thank you, Zeke, for those kind words. So we are excited to kick off today, a day that really focuses on the research themes that Perry World House will be taking on. But I have to start by saying that when you are the new director of a new institution, the night before your grand opening, polishing the floors and getting ready for the day to start, the phone call you don't want at 5 p.m. on a Sunday night is when your keynote speaker for the next morning at 9 a.m. calls to say she's been taken to hospital and won't be joining you. So I am the bringer of bad news that Arti Prabhakar is in the hospital and not with us this morning. I am also the bringer of good news that we have brought together what will be, I think, a exciting, interesting, and engaging panel focused on the same broad set of issues. Questions around technology and policy, questions around America's national security, and where technology fits in that. And to that end, I'd like to invite the panel to come up on the stage, and I'll introduce them once they're up here or as they're coming up. So David Heyman recently stepped down after 5 years as Assistant Secretary of Policy for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. David got a phone call at 6 o'clock last night saying, would you mind getting on the 5 a.m. Acela train and being here? And for that, we are deeply grateful. But we are also grateful for David's service to the United States as Assistant Secretary for Policy. And David and I share having been the drafters of 2 quadrennial reviews of the U.S. government. I, the quadrennial QDDR, the Quadrennial Development and Diplomacy Review, and David, the first and second ever quadrennial Homeland Security reviews. I think we might have had to sign off on the others' documents at the time. But David also brings the kind of background that we look to here at Perry Worldhouse, having begun his career as a computer systems software engineer, integrating technology and policy, and having also worked at the White House with the Aspen Strategy Group, and now is the CEO of Tectonics Global. David, thank you so much for coming. Sure. Next to David is a man who at Penn needs no introduction, Dean Vijay Kumar, Dean of the Penn School of Engineering. He is also the Nemirovsky Family Professor and has appointments both in the departments of Mechanical Engineering and Applied Mechanics, Computer Science, and Information Science. He is perhaps best known for his work running the GRASP Lab, the lab that really has been at the forefront of robotics and drone technology. But beyond that, he is a deep thinker who has really come to understand the role that technology can play and has a vision over the horizon of where technology is headed. Vijay, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Next to Vijay is Michael Boyle. Michael is a visiting scholar here at Perry Worldhouse and an associate professor at LaSalle here in Philadelphia. Michael, too, got a call at 6 p.m. last night. The good news is when you call someone who you were best man in his wedding for, he has no choice but to say yes. But Michael also fits perfectly on this panel. He has written one book on post-conflict violence, is currently finishing a book on the legal and ethical implications of drone warfare, soon to be published by Routledge. And Michael, we're delighted that you are the kind of visiting scholar that Penn and Perry Worldhouse can host and that you're with us here. To his left is our moderator for this morning, Michael Horowitz. Michael is the Associate Director of Perry Worldhouse and an Associate Professor of Political Science at Penn. He is one of the two faculty co-directors of our theme around the future of the global order, which he'll say more about later. He's the author of numerous books, in particularly The Diffusion of Military Technology, Causes and Consequences for International Politics. He has been widely published, but he too integrates academia and policy, having served at the Department of Defense, working on policy issues there for the Undersecretary for Defense for Policy. So Michael, over to you as the moderator. A deep debt of gratitude to everyone who's on the panel today who last night had no idea they would be here. Thank you so much.
All right. We were all expecting this, and we're very well prepared. It's a real honor to be here to kick off Perry Worldhouse and with such a distinguished group of panelists. And I want to start by just saying a couple of words about what we're going to be talking about, and then I'm going to actually kick it over to Dean Kumar for the first question. And there was a time when global security came down to tanks rolling down the battlefields, ships sailing across the ocean. States raised army and navies to protect themselves, and they made decisions based on that. And now, in a world of emerging technologies, from high-speed internet and reliance on it, robotic soldiers that seem to be able to kill people around the world, it's upended the security chessboard. And technology has created new threats to the world, as well as potential solutions to issues such as climate change, to delivery of services and humanitarian disasters, and in other areas. So in this panel, what we're going to explore is what these new technologies are, what they will be, and how they're changing what societies are going to be dealing with, both in terms of the threats that they face and the opportunities that emerging technologies are potentially creating for global society. And there's no better place to start with that than the Dean of Penn's Engineering School, Vijay Kumar. So Vijay, to start out, there seems to be so much promise in the technologies of today, from robotics to artificial intelligence to the Internet of Things and beyond. Can you talk about some of the work that you're doing yourself in supporting at the Penn Engineering School, and maybe beyond that, on the cutting edge of emerging technologies?
Thanks, Michael. First of all, let me just say it's just a pleasure to be here. The opening event of the opening grand event and being the first part of the kickoff. And again, before I answer your question, let me just say if there's one thing that is truly global today, it's really technology innovation. Today, work that's being done by our students in our lab, they publish a paper. Tomorrow, there are people in China and Germany who are reading those papers and trying to bring those ideas to fruition in a commercial setting. And the other way around, too. We interact with companies all around the world, our faculty, our students, and there's just a rich exchange of ideas which are truly international. The second thing I'll also say is that if you look at the global challenges that are confronting our civilization, our planet, and again, I might be a little parochial here, but to me, the critical path to all those challenges goes right through an engineering school. And accordingly, when we think about what kinds of ideas to promote in our school, we think about these challenges. And so to me, it's really appropriate that I get a chance to discuss some of this with you. This is an exciting place and exciting time to be thinking about technology, particularly in Penn engineering. I'll just point out a few interesting trends over the last 5 years that some of you are aware of, but might have not have taken the time to think through. First, the cost of doing so many different things is decreasing. You think about the cost of computation, the cost of storing data, the cost of communicating over wireless. All of these technologies, the cost has been coming down at roughly 30% a year. The cost of batteries, lithium-based batteries, 12% every year. The cost of renewables has dropped about 75% over the last 5 years. It's also true for sequencing your genome. Today, you can all sequence your genome for a cost less than $1,000. Just 5 years ago, that cost was $25,000. And 10 years ago, does anyone remember what the cost was? You couldn't do it, right? That's the pace of technology change, and that's why I feel fortunate to be living in today's environment in this fast-paced world of technology change. The other benefit to this is that because the cost is dropping, the barrier to for people who want to innovate in this field is coming down. And this, again, is an international phenomenon. There are young students who are all excited about technology, and the barrier for them to get into the field has just dropped significantly. Not only has the cost dropped, but also the time to create things has come down, right? This idea of, well, I have this great concept. I want to go from this concept to a prototype. I want to test it out, and then discover that the prototype fails, but that's okay. I learn, and I go back and redesign and re-innovate. This time, the time to create, test, and innovate has just dropped dramatically. It used to be true in the software world even at the beginning of this century, but now it's transferred over to the hardware world. Hardware is the new software. The time to create and innovate has just come down dramatically. And a byproduct of both these things, which is the cost coming down and the time to innovate coming down, is that we're attracting now the best minds to the field of technology. So this is true at Penn Engineering. It's also true across the technology fields in various countries. So in engineering, we're focusing on what we think are the 3 big trends today, and this is what we want to be doing over the next 5 years. So one, challenges in health. Everybody down from the president, the vice president, to the common person realizes that our big challenges now are in pandemics, in cancer, in understanding the brain, and so on. And again, the critical path to understanding some of these challenges goes through a technology. So I believe medicine is, of course, a big dog, but there's a small tail technology that's wagging medicine right now. And this is something we really need to come to grips with. And a great place to do it is Penn. Surrounded by world-class health schools, we think we can really have an impact. And a lot of our faculty are engaged in that effort. The second effort is really centering around data. So today, the amount of data you can store in the cloud is doubling every 9 months. By year 2020, people predict that we'll have 20 times 10 to the 21 bytes of data somewhere in cyberspace. In case you're interested, that's 20,000 exabytes. Another prediction I have is that we'll probably invent a new prefix to characterize the amount of data we'll have. Perhaps you can do that yourself. But that's the amount of data we will have. And the interesting thing is it's completely changing our paradigm of how we do science and technology. So if Isaac Newton were alive today, instead of inventing the tools of calculus to understand how gravity works, he might have discovered gravity through data, right? just by observations, and that just leads to a new calculus for innovation, understanding of data using machine learning and other technologies to build predictive models. The third area we're focusing on, so again, by the way, to go from data to information and how that impacts society, again, an organization like the World Perry World House is uniquely equipped to deal with these challenges because it really impacts all of us today. And then the third area, we have probably the world's best facility in nanoscience and nanotechnology. So today, we're able to synthesize devices at the molecular level on up, and we truly have the opportunity to create nanoscale systems and technologies that can impact all areas, but we're focusing, again, on grand challenges. The few grand challenges, the F stands for food, E stands for energy, and W stands for water. If you can attack those problems, and again, you look at our production system, the one production system whose efficiency has been declining over the last 10 years instead of improving is the agriculture production system. So if we can develop new technologies, new sensors for monitoring crops and doing the equivalent of precision medicine but for crops, it'll completely change the food landscape in the coming years. And if you can solve the food problem, you automatically solve the water problem. Water accounts for 80% of agriculture, agriculture accounts for 80% of water use today. So those are sort of three areas that are truly exciting that our engineering school is engaged in.
Thanks, Vijay. And David, as Assistant Secretary for Policy and Homeland Security, you were in charge of setting policy for one of the largest institutions in the government and for keeping us safe. What's the role that science and technology play in the broad array of tools that DHS has in keeping the country safe?
Well, thank you. Let me thank Zeke and Bill and the University of Pennsylvania, Perry World House for inviting me here last night. And I should say also...
He was the first call.
I should say I have gotten calls at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I always respond, so I was here.
Thank you.
Let me just answer that by setting some context here, because as you said in your setup, the historic and traditional model for national security has dramatically changed. We've, until frankly, within the last 15, 20 years at most, have really looked at national security as state actors against state actors, militaries protecting against border infiltrations and the like. And that has really dramatically shifted in the last 15 years. Amongst the changes that we're seeing, and I'll probably go over three of them, in 2010, for the first time in human history, there were more people living in cities than anywhere else, than in the urban areas, in the farming and rural areas. And that's going to continue up through the next century, where most of the world will live in cities. As that trend continues, it drives a heck of a lot of change and challenges to society with the food challenges, the economic challenges, the public health challenges, the economic security challenges, but also questions about the resilience of cities to deal with failing infrastructure. And the second great change that's going on is the climate change, right? So we had COP21 in December, where the nations of the world came together to say we're going to deal with climate change. They put together an action plan. If they're successful, if we are successful, and we achieve all that was promised in December, we'll only make a dent on the 1 degree difference that we've made, that the humans have made in the temperature change. It's going to continue to rise for another degree for the next 50 years. What that means is the severe and extreme weather we've been seeing, and we've been seeing more and more with greater and greater consequences over the last 15, 20 years, will continue to grow. And our cities need to be able to be resilient to those types of severe weather challenges. So there's the urbanization, there's the weather changes. Vijay talks about technology. The tremendous change in the costs and the size of technology, miniaturization and the ability to diffuse technology to anyone. Everyone becomes a maker and producer, not just a consumer of technology. And with that, we have the digitization of the world. the servicization of the world, I like to say, where ICT, information and communication technologies, pervade every aspect of life. And with the change in time and the speed of acceleration of technology, Vijay mentioned 9 months. It used to be, in some cases, Moore's Law was 18 months. 9 months or 18 months. That means our changes in society are changing that rapidly as well. And we as a society need to be able to adapt, if we can, to every aspect of life where technology is pervasive. And then the fourth area, which is much closer, although all of this comes to address in Homeland Security, is the borders question. There's a dramatic change in the way the nature of borders and global flows are emerging. In the last probably 20 years or so, we've seen more people living and working in countries they were not born in, more capital flows, communications, trades, exchanges between peoples, businesses, et cetera, than any other time in history. That fluidity of people, ideas, commerce, capital, finance is changing the nature of the centerpiece of international affairs, which is the notion of sovereignty, which has been the notion that has been the centerpiece for over 400 years, almost 400 years. Over the past few decades, global flows of all of these things have not just become a luxury for economic exchange and the way we lead our lives, but rather it's a necessity, a working requirement of nation states for them to thrive and succeed in the world. And as such, nation states can no longer fully delimit themselves by borders because of this rapid flow that's essential for their own survival. So if you take all of those areas, there are, in Homeland Security, I should say, just for those who haven't heard of it before, you've probably heard of it. Everyone's heard of Homeland Security, but actually not as many people are familiar with the 5 missions of Homeland Security, which were defined as such: preventing terrorism, enforcing our immigration system and laws, managing our borders and securing our borders, and then 2 new missions that came online in effect in 2010 with the quadrennial review that Bill mentioned. Cybersecurity, administering and enforcing and safeguarding cyberspace. And then another new mission, which is establishing national resilience or building national resilience. So if you think of all the things I just talked about, you can see Homeland Security in almost every aspect there. And if you look at the front page, you'll see Homeland Security, which is why it's the 3rd largest agency in the federal government, 220,000 people, and in over 70 countries around the world. The things that come out of these changes, there are 4 things that we can talk about. I'll just put them out there for discussion, that are creating and transforming the threat spectrum for which we have to deal with on a nation state. Previously militaries and nation states, today asymmetric threats. And the 4 that I concern most about: microbes and the emergence of diseases that, or reemergence of diseases that our societies are no longer able to manage, electrons, cybersecurity, and the pervasiveness of connection of digital technology introduces new vulnerability to society as well as supporting it. Individuals are lone wolves in the counterterrorism threat that we have to face. And finally, carbon, which we talked about. Those are all very, very, very small things that have great, great impact on society today and are changing the way we think about national security, and I look forward to talking about them.
Great. Now, Mike, I want to focus in with you on one particular piece of technology. You're a world-leading expert on drones. You've written multiple articles and in a book about it. It's a very particular sort of technology with the potential to shape our future. What does your research suggest about the dark side of this technology?
Well, first of all, let me say it's a real pleasure to be here on this panel, and I'd like to thank all of my fellow panelists for being here today. I'd also like to say I couldn't imagine a nicer place to be a visiting faculty member than Perry Worldhouse. It's been a real pleasure to be here and work on my research. To talk a little bit about the dark side of the technology, and I should start by saying when we think about drone technology, there's an enormous number of opportunities that come from it. So by no means am I arguing that this sort of technology is a bad thing or that we're not going to see huge amounts of social good arise from drone technology. Huge, in a Donald Trump way, yeah. That's going to emerge from a sort of from the proliferation of drone technology.
Sorry.
But I would argue that there's also been a shift in vulnerabilities. I mean, if we think about this, the United States has enjoyed the last 10 years where it's been the predominant drone power. It's been able to engage in drone strikes in places like Pakistan and in Yemen, really with more or less huge inequalities in the amount of technology and the qualitative advantage in technology that it has. Today, we live in a world under which 90 countries have drone programs. 30 of those programs are armed. We now see a world under which a number of non-state actors now have drone technology. If you follow the war in Syria, you can see the Islamic State is now flying relatively rudimentary DIY or hobbyist drones over the battlefield in order to do battlefield reconnaissance. We see situations under which Al-Qaeda is trying to develop a cell to build its own drones. Hezbollah has actually conducted a drone strike. And so we're moving from a world under which the United States and its partners and allies had an enormous qualitative advantage in drones and really could essentially own that space into a world under which there's a lot more players in that space. And what that begins to do is it begins to shift vulnerabilities, right? And so one danger with this is that you begin to see things like terrorist attacks with drones. Are we going to start to see someone who wants to launch a relatively low-tech terrorist attack use maybe a commercial or hobbyist drone, right, in order to be able to do so? And there's potentials for that. The other question becomes sort of what do states and non-state actors start to do when they have the technology? So when you give me a new tool, suddenly what I can do, what I will do begins to shift slightly. And that's particularly what I'm interested in is do you start to see shifts in incentives, shifts in calculations of risks, shifts in goals as a result of this? So to give you some examples, we're starting to see cases under which North Korea is flying drones over the DMZ to rattle South Korea. We're now in a case under which Hamas is taking drones and flying it over Israeli nuclear facilities in order to rattle Israel. And you start to have real strategic consequences flow from this. How do states respond to it? And I think one of the most interesting questions when we think about drone technology is, how do we think of the technology? Do we think that shooting down a drone is equivalent to shooting down a manned aircraft? Or do we think it's equivalent to shooting down a weather balloon? Because there are very different strategic consequences flowing from that. If you were to shoot down my manned aircraft, that's a very serious threat. If we accept that we can sort of rattle each other's nerves with drones, it's a very different kind of normative consequence from it. Different sets of strategic consequences flow from that as well. So what my concern really is, once you get this kind of technology, you're going to see a lot of other actors that are going to try and find uses for it. And those uses are not necessarily going to mirror what the United States does. One of the most important things I think we have to do as a government is to think about, well, how can other actors use drones? And we shouldn't make the mistake of assuming they'll use it in the same way we will. They will use it in ways we did not anticipate, and we can begin to see transferences in sort of goals, incentives, and even what they would assume is an acceptable risk as a result of having a new sort of weapon in their hands.
Thanks, Mike. I want to actually broaden back up now and turn back to Vijay. I mean, Vijay, you spent a few years in the U.S. government recently working in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and like Mike said, we've taken for granted in some ways the idea that the United States will be the world's leader in emerging science and technology areas. Is that perception still true? What is the U.S. government doing, and what should it be doing more broadly in the science and technology arena?
So I might be off on a little bit, but my feeling really is that if you look at tech innovation, the U.S. is still the world leader. And one of the reasons we're world leaders is because of our policy towards immigration. We attract the best talent from the world. They come here, they come to top universities like Penn because of the environment, the welcoming environment we create. And as long as that continues to happen, and I'm hoping no walls will be built across any borders, I think that'll continue to happen. It's about people. So this is the tech innovation piece. But there's a complementary piece, which is entrepreneurship, which is creating the ecosystem that takes this innovation and brings it to market. And these two go hand in hand, but now that second piece doesn't have to be co-located with the tech innovation piece. And already we're seeing this in China. So 5 years ago, China was nowhere in the robotics drone space. Today, they are the undisputed world leaders in drones. In fact, a lot of the inexpensive solutions that Mike was talking about really comes from China. But second, again, ideas that we might develop here get translated into production in China at a fraction of the cost that we can actually, that'll take for us to develop it here because of the ecosystem they have. Everything from the supply chain and what I love to call state involvement and capitalism. So China is very good at that, and they have the manpower to do this too, the human power to do this too. So while these two things go hand in hand, in my mind they're distinct. In one area, which is tech innovation, I think we still are indisputed world leaders. But because these two things become, and all our thinkings get mixed, it's not so clear to disambiguate the two pieces, and then you might come up with different conclusions.
That's great. And David, I don't know how much television you watch, but I watch a lot of television. And one of my favorite new TV shows over the last 2 years is Mr. Robot, which is a show about hackers attempting to take down modern banking society. And the lead for that, Rami Malek, won an Emmy last night. And it was really interesting hearing you talk about the cyber dimension as an area that Homeland Security has really brought on board over the last few years. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about both what Homeland Security is doing in the cyber arena and how you view it as an area of both threat and opportunity.
Okay, well, let me just start by what I watch on TV. I don't watch much. I did try to watch this Homeland series when it first came out, but it became too much like work, so I decided not to watch it.
Downer.
Actually, the producers of Homeland were the ones who did 24, which
Right.
if you go back on the internet, you'll see me on a panel with them discussing how real Jack Bauer's life was. So the cyberspace is a new space for our government. It's a growth space, and it's a space of great challenge. We, until 2010, the federal government did not own that space in any way, shape, or form. There were parts of the government that certainly did work in that space. But in 2010, the Department of Homeland Security established cybersecurity as a mission. And what that meant was, and what was allocated to the Department of Homeland Security versus the Department of Defense, was protection of .gov and kind of everything but .mil, which is quite large. And we did that because there needed to be somebody in charge, and there needed to be a government role. Everybody saw the threats escalating, and there was not the capabilities to match it. The challenge has been getting those capabilities in place. Two things in particular are challenging. One is the arcane and ridiculous procurement policies that the federal government subscribes to, all for good reason, to make sure that we don't have people unfairly getting opportunities to get paid by the federal government. But also, so fairness is really important. But the cycle, the timelines for procurement are too long. And what happens is that you end up having technological change and innovation before the technology is even put in the field, and you're behind 1 or 2 cycles, and there's no opportunity to catch up. That's number one. Number two is, while we are great at attracting people to come to America, we're not good at keeping them here. You'll see in the STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics space, we are one of the world's leaders, if not the world's leader, in attracting folks. People they spend years in the United States getting educated, and then their visa runs out and they leave. And they go back and they start up a startup somewhere else, and all of the network and opportunity sometimes moves with them. So there's an economic downfall, there's a national security implications, there's huge implications. Those things need to change. Until those are changed, we will fall further and further behind. In fact, there is a resource crisis right now, an engineering crisis, I would say, not in the academic space where people are there's actually too much competition for jobs like this. There's a lot of good folks. But in the government space, we can't attract enough people to stay in there competing with the private sector, and the private sector can't get enough folks because there's just not enough engineers coming out, particularly in software and engineering and things like that. So the US government in particular at the Department of Homeland Security has changed 2 things to try to address that. One, something called Other Transactions Authority, which the Department of Defense had, was established a year or 2 ago. to change that procurement cycle. And that allows for a much more creative opportunity to bring technology into the cyberspace in particular. That's where it started. And two, in the human capital space, different retention authorities for trying to attract and retain the best and the brightest in the federal government. We still have a huge problem in the nation and around the globe, building enough human capacity to support the world, the digital world we're trying to create. And we will continue to lag behind there until some of the incentives for people to remain where they are educated are changed.
If I can just jump in. So what I said is consistent with what you were saying, David. So this is why I try to distinguish between tech innovation, where I think we are still the leaders, but when it comes to taking that and the entrepreneurship that follows, we end up expelling a lot of the people who can actually contribute to our own economy. So this is a common theme, I think, in the field of technology.
So you're seeing the intersection between human capital, immigration policy, and technological innovation, and that those aren't necessarily silos, but they're all part of the same equation.
Let me just put a fine point on it. At Homeland Security, we created authority to build the human capacity for people to support cybersecurity, and then we, Department of Homeland Security, have the Immigration and Customs Enforcement folks who have to ask them to leave when they overstay their visa. That's a problem.
So Mike, turning back to you, I want to ask a question about whether sometimes we may spend too much time talking about technology. You know, after all, there were some horrible events over the weekend, including a pipe bomb going off in or near Chelsea, depending on your definition of New York, and knife attacks in Minnesota at a shopping mall. So it's clear that in addition to militant groups trying to use technologies such as drones, there are also a lot more traditional and in low-tech ways that security challenges can emerge. How should we be thinking about then the intersection of high and low technology?
So I would argue that what we're seeing is a kind of divergence, and the divergence works in the following way. Increasingly, states are competing with each other in kind of relatively high-tech ways. If you think, for example, the cyber hacking that goes on, we see an increasing amount of cyber warfare between states, or at least cyber espionage. You also are seeing signaling with drones between states. So we're increasingly seeing a high-tech competition at the state level. At the non-state actor level, although you're seeing innovation with technology, as we said, terrorist organizations are beginning to use drones, at least in the developed world, increasingly they're going low-tech. So you're seeing a lot more attacks that work like the Minnesota attack. Someone comes out into a mall with a knife. And part of the reason they're doing this is that that space is incredibly hard to do in a developed world, that we've gotten better in terms of homeland security and law enforcement in the last 15 to 20 years to anticipate threats. Intelligence has gotten better. And as a result, you see terrorist organizations saying, if I want to hit a hard target, I can no longer get onto the planes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to attack the airport waiting terminal. If I can no longer get near a military installation or a police installation, I'm going to go into a shopping mall with a knife. And so I think one of the interesting things that you begin to see is you see a lot of technological innovation among non-state actors in active battlefields. If you look, for example, in the battlefield in Syria and Iraq, you see technological innovation. But in the United States and in Western Europe, increasingly it's more and more low-tech. And the reason that is the case is because they know that low-tech is extremely hard to defend. How do you stop someone walking into a mall with a knife and stabbing people? Very difficult to do. And the Islamic State specifically has actually argued that that's what the strategy should be, that because it's harder and harder to hit most targets in the developing world, that they're encouraging people to sort of self-select into the jihad, to take low forms of technology, and to do as much harm as they can to spread fear. And the problem with that is, although you could potentially police some of those things, at what cost to your liberties do you do so? So that's putting us really with a very sharp problem in the United States. If increasingly terrorist threats in places like Western Europe, the United States go low tech, and the only thing we can do is vastly increase surveillance to stop that from happening, we can't check everybody who walks into a mall, then what do we do, right? And that is posing a real threat to sort of our democratic freedoms in the long run if we go down the road of sort of surveillance for all those things. We might have to live in a world under which there are low-tech threats like that happen. And the question is, how do we respond in a sensible way? How do we not give it political salience? How do we not give them strategic benefits as a result of doing those kind of attacks like we saw in New York and in Minnesota over the weekend?
So the question of government policy here in some ways looms large, and governments have traditionally thought about protecting themselves in terms of military force and security. And you've all mentioned hacking in one way or another, and one of the most infamous real-world hacks, sort of not on television, was the alleged Russian hack of the DNC earlier this year, and the revelation of of confidential Democratic Party information from that. In a world where foreign governments or non-state actors may be targeting not just sort of .gov, to put it in US government parlance, but other areas of society as well, which could include .edu for all of us that are at Penn, how should governments be thinking about it? How should the organizations that are targeted be thinking about that? For any of you that would want to jump in on it.
Let me get to that, but I don't want to leave, not to use that word, the hacking that went on in Minnesota, but the low-tech attacks, because that's becoming more and more prevalent. It's becoming more of an increase of concern. And I just want to spend a little bit of time on that because I think that's on the forefront of people's minds because it can happen anywhere and people feel vulnerable about that. It was not the threat du jour 5 years ago, okay? It wasn't until 2008 that we saw about 20 Somali Americans go abroad when we had to shift our thinking from the sort of large-scale attacks that we saw on 9/11 and attempted elsewhere, like the 7/7 London attacks, to what if these individuals come back and do stuff on their own in the United States? And so in 2008, 2009, we started rethinking does our infrastructure that we put in place for Homeland Security and counterterrorism match that? And the answer was no. And it wasn't until 2011 and 12 that we had the first national strategy on countering violent extremism looking within the United States. And that gets to the asymmetric threat, first and foremost with countering violent extremism, but it also addresses some of these other concerns about not so much low tech, but low profile, smaller scale attacks, to include hacking, which is now more pervasive because the cost has gone down. It's extraordinarily high tech, but it becomes low tech because it's off the shelf tools that people can just grab offline. And the solution that the government has moved towards is to say, look, we are not a paternalistic society. The government can't be in all places at all times. Our communities, must be empowered to protect themselves. Government can support that, but it is at the community level where you start to see these threats emerge. And so the question of how you empower communities to protect themselves. Let me just tell one quick story on this. In the Iraq, in 2005 and 6, when the Iraq campaign and IED campaigns were getting out of control, there was a strategy that was developed at the Defense Department. It was $7 billion looking at IEDs, but the concept that came about to work best was this notion of left of boom, where there was a whole effort to up-armor the vehicles. Maybe that would protect them against the IEDs. And then try to jam them as soon as you were in the area. All of those things are just about at boom, okay? And that was not succeeding, wasn't succeeding well enough. Left of boom is getting to the networks that build the bombs through intelligence and data and all sorts of analytics. And that's what made the difference and turned the tides on the IED campaign in Iraq. In countering violent extremisms with these individuals who are now becoming inspired, self-radicalized, and moving into communities to do what they choose to do with whatever weapons they can get their hands on, we need to have a left of boom strategy, which means before the government has a role to play, communities have a role to play. When somebody is thinking about doing something malevolent, they're not committing a crime until they have intent, until they start operationalizing that. But it turns out if you look at all of these individual actors, or sometimes two actors, you watch the interviews now from going forward on these types of attacks. Somebody always knows. It's like Agatha Christie. Somebody knew that the individual had disappeared from their social networks, that they were indicating the number of signs, and we did research, social research at the Department of Homeland Security that gave some indications of when people were going left of boom in the wrong direction. And what we need to do, you've heard it, if you see something, say something. If you don't see something, there's nobody who can help support. You get individuals, whether it's an individual's going to shoot a school up who's not a radical Islamic terrorist, or is somebody who's inspired by Daesh from Syria, there's indicators that are taking place, and we as a community need to be involved in our own protection.
That's great. Vijay, is there any way you could jump in a little bit to think about I mean, in the Minnesota case specifically, there's at least, there have been some allegations, funny, I'm going to say on the internet and then ask you a question about the internet, on the internet, that there may have been a process of self-radicalization perhaps, and it shows the role of information technology in a way, that information technology is something that unites us and that gives us the ability to communicate with people around the world. When your students or colleagues post papers and they're being read the next day in Germany and China, but also then it can be used to divide us.
Well, technology, I think, offers solutions, and in some sense is also the source of all the problems that we are facing, right? So I think the best, just going back to the point about low tech versus high tech, the asymmetry arises because fundamentally it's very, very hard to write good programs, and it's very, very easy to write bad programs. So if you're somebody who's in the business of writing bad programs, you write thousands of them. If one of them succeeds, you've done your job. Well, if you want to write programs, and here's an example of a good program, I'd like to be able to mine all the information that's there in the social network and look for things that are not there, right? This is the anomaly detection problem. This is extremely hard to do right now. The people who are actually developing these technologies, the so-called machine learning experts, will tell you that given enough data, they can solve anything. But part of the problem then is getting the data. And so this is a vicious circle that a lot of bright minds are working towards. So coming back to the question, what's the role of government? I think it's very, very hard to anticipate all the threats that we'll face and then say, well, for this threat, we're going to have this solution. For this one, we'll have that solution. Because there'll always be people who will come up with different types of scenarios and different ways of using technology. So the best thing I think we can really do is to try and train the best and the brightest. And again, it goes back, I think, to what I said earlier about attracting the best talent and making sure that they're vigilant. So this is, again, something that David touched on. And that arguably, that's the best thing you can do in outside the classified world. Of course, and I don't have security clearance. Inside the classified world, you could obviously take more steps. But to me, it again comes back to talent. Having spent 18 months in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, I came to the conclusion it is never about budgets. Yes, we complain about budgets. It's never about equipment. It's never about resources. It's about talent. So if you can get the best, I mean, I'm a pathological optimist, and I think we are attracting the best talent. If you get the best talent, you'll solve a lot of these problems.
On the internet radicalization point, a couple things. One is, I think there's a way that people often describe internet radicalization that sort of, I went on the interline, I read some things, I read critiques of US foreign policy, and suddenly it tipped me over into joining the Islamic State or joining Al-Qaeda. And I think that discussion, you often get that from a lot of politicians. That's a real mistake. There's a selection effect that goes on here. You find information that you're looking for online. You don't just simply go on and read critiques of US foreign policy and join Al-Qaeda. And so to some extent, I think our model of internet radicalization needs to be a little bit more sophisticated. It often works like a tipping point. There's a series of social triggers, there's intellectual issues involved in it, there's a policy critique, and then you start to see that people are being radicalized. And I think it's extraordinarily difficult. We need to mobilize communities. That's the most important thing to do. But it's very difficult to mobilize communities in a sensitive way when sometimes our politics makes it much more difficult to do that in a kind of coherent way, right? So think about what's happening in the presidential election. Some of the comments that are made about Muslims by Donald Trump make it very difficult for the United States to have a sensible community policing strategy when at the very high level there's demonization of whole groups going on. And so to some extent, I think in all of this radicalization, the story is a lot more complicated than it is often sometimes depicted by a lot of our politicians, that we need to have really good community intelligence, really good law enforcement, but find a way under which you give a space for people to be critical and not assume that just because I read the wrong website, I'm necessarily going to move into the direction of engaging in some kind of violent action.
That's great. So I now want to, I have two more questions that I want to ask the panelists, and then I want to open it up for you all to have, to ask your questions. And the first one I want to ask is, what's an example of a technology that maybe we haven't spent any time talking about that you think is very important for the globe, whether it's in the national security arena or beyond, and why? And if you had to bet on particular technologies, what are the areas that you view as the most promising?
I'm going to let the Dean of Engineering go first.
And then somebody might disagree with him.
What's
the first one? What's
saying? It's hard to make predictions, especially about the future.
Right.
But let me make my predictions. So I think, to me,
You're the guy with the budget.
The one big thing that I think a lot about is autonomy, not just because it's an area that I know a little bit about, having worked in robotics for 25 years, but I think we're seeing a trend towards machines doing things autonomously. A little different from automation. If I stick my clothes in the washing machine and they get washed, that's automation. But here you have machines now that are sensing the real world, thinking for themselves, and then making decisions. Self-driving cars being a great example of that. So this is happening, and there's a lot of hype about that. I'm happy to talk to you about what is hype and what is not. But it is happening. There's a lot of commercial interest in this space, and it has great implications for us. I think one thing you can ask, and we can look at ourselves, we can look at our next door neighbors, and ask, which jobs will be eliminated in the next 5 years, and will that person or will I have a job? And this is a serious question. It's not just meant in jest. There will come a point where, and by the way, we've seen this in the past. Technological innovation has always changed the way we think about jobs. You think about the field of agriculture over the last 150 years. You think about typing and how word processors have been replaced. Word processors have replaced typewriters, and secretaries have lost jobs. But in all of these cases, people have managed to retrain themselves. In fact, I would argue more jobs have been created. So what's different this time about autonomy? Well, it goes back to what I said before. It's the time scale at which things are changing. So you can look at several time scales. You can look at time scales of your careers. You can look at a time scale of an average politician in Washington, D.C., which is about 4 to 8 years, perhaps, depending on whether you get elected a second term as president or not. But the time scale of technology change today is much, much smaller than either the 4 to 8 years or your career, which hopefully is 30 to 40 years. And so the ability of somebody to retool themselves that quickly is somewhat limited. So when systems become autonomous, when robots start doing things, and there's software systems that start making decisions for you and doing analytics at a speed that we can never do, I think our normal, the belief that we have, the more you study, the more knowledge you acquire, the more you'll get paid, the more likely you'll have a job, that'll go away. Let me give you a very specific example. So you think about a pyramid, lots of people at the bottom with very little skills, making not a lot of money, and very few people at the top having advanced degrees, perhaps the ability to think analytically and make decisions. And then you ask which of these people will have their jobs taken away. Well, paradoxically, the guys at the bottom are actually quite safe. It is very, very hard today to make robots to clean up your living room, or to clean the bathroom, or to pick strawberries. Those are really, really hard problems. So they probably will have jobs, but people in the middle who are very well skilled in analytics will start losing jobs, right? And the question is, what other jobs can they? So to me, this is a big disruptive trend that I think we should be thinking about. Again, it's a global trend. And then let me give you another prediction, and now this is from the stand. So as I told you earlier, I'm an optimist, right? So if I take a poll here and I ask you, how many of you think that a city like Philadelphia 5 years from now will be completely free of fossil fuels? How many of you will put your hands up?
What? Hands?
Completely free of fossil fuels, except for air travel, which is hard. So nobody, right? So let me give you 5 trends that suggest that this actually may be a reasonable thing to put your bet on.
Going up then.
Right? So one, I already said, the cost of renewables is coming down. The second also I pointed out, the cost of batteries is coming down. Third, electric cars. In 2015, out of every 150, one out of every 150 cars had a plug in it, right? Could be plugged in 2015. In 2016, it might be 5, maybe 10 out of 150. The cost of an electric car today, you can buy one for $30,000, right? Third, the sharing economy. So the sharing economy takes off, and if, in fact, renewables are available in every house, then people will share not only cars, they'll also share energy. And then the fifth thing I want to point out is the one actually I'm most skeptical about, which is self-driving cars. It's an area I work in, and naturally I'm a little skeptical about. So if that happens, 20%, 80% of the cars that are on the road today will go away. We will rethink the way we use real estate. So for example, in Los Angeles, 60% of the real estate now is used for highways and parking lots. And LA people will tell you they don't know the difference between the two things. But we will rethink all of that. So in 5 years, we will be generating our own energy, and the cost of generation will be less than the cost of distribution, which means everything will happen in the city. Right? So this is possible, and all you have to do is follow these trends to the logical conclusion, and then come up with the conclusion that I did. So again, I'm a pathological optimist, but I think technology will do great things for us in the next 5 years.
I mean, I'll throw out my sort of 3D printing. I think and this stems from my concern, which is, first off, an interest in seeing as costs drop, you're going to start seeing unleashing creativity. And I think that's going to be absolutely magnificent, the number of things that you can do. What you were describing, which is the sort of shortening the time to the prototype when you get 3D printing up and running, and as 3D printing drops in cost, you're going to begin to see those prototypes be able to be developed more quickly. At the same time, I'm a little bit more of a pessimist. When you start to do that, you also start to maximize vulnerabilities, right? There's new things that you can produce, there's new things that you can print that may not be for the betterment of all mankind. So if there was a technology I was going to watch in the future, that's the one that I would watch, but I would also want to think about sort of what are the consequences of lowering the cost of production and allowing people to build things that may not be for all of our benefits that quickly. I wouldn't stop it. I would still encourage it. I would just try to think about safeguards.
It's a big question, and I'm humble enough not to have the answer. But let me just say there's a lot of things, if we talk about the threats we talked about in society up front, that we need some big answers, and we need them fast, whether it's the extreme weather that we're experiencing, the rise of and reemergence of pathogens that can have devastating effect, cyber attacks that can have global consequences at the speed of light now in our infrastructure, and the question of food security that has tremendous impact in terms of dislocating communities. In fact, there's an interesting report about how Syria, the Syria crisis may have emerged out of a food security problem. So I'd love to see, precision agriculture, precision medicine, urban technologies that address energy consumption and things like that. That said, as I have to say that as one of the authors of our first national strategy on resilience, and bringing that into as a concept, we've now considered, in some cases, a national strategic asset. We're still working on it, but that was 10 years after 9/11, and despite the fact of the tremendous resilience that went on in New York and the narrative that came out of that city as a resilient city, as a national asset, not until 10 years later. So I'd love to see things that are akin to self-healing systems, both because of the concern about infrastructure. We have a $3.6 trillion deficit in the United States over the next 4 years in terms of infrastructure needs. Globally, it's $56 trillion. The costs of replacing decaying infrastructure and maintaining it is going to continue to go up. The notion of self-healing systems that identify and help ameliorate the degradation of our civil society, of our cities, I think could be a great help because it also addresses some of the energy and climate questions. But I wouldn't say any of those. I personally am concerned, and Vijay talks about the speed of technological change. I personally would like to see research done in the social realm, having a better understanding of the impact on human condition of this change. We're seeing tremendous disorder of the world systems over the last 5 to 10 years, I believe creating great anxiety and discomfort across the globe. And when our children are sitting next to us, or not sitting next to us, I should say, learning how to read on a 6x8 electronic pad, lacking the human contact of a reader, of a parent or a friend or relative, when they're being taught by some one-dimensional, two-dimensional thing coming out of a screen as opposed to a teacher before you and their peers, that's changing the way we experience the world. And those of us who didn't grow up with that, which is the preponderance of the world, the people who are running the world today, as it were, are having difficulty adapting to the tremendous change, which will only continue because we're not going to change technology. So I'm not going to pick a technology, I'm going to pick an understanding of the human condition in the change that we're continuing to experience to make sure that we can adapt readily.
Now I want to open it up to you all and get a sense of your questions for our tremendous panel here today. In the back? Do we have a microphone?
I'm Steve Roth, an alumnus from class of 66, 1966. You've talked a lot about challenges related to technology and the opportunities related to that. One of the things you've kind of touched on a little bit, and David's last comment spurred my question, is the challenge of the political aspect of all of these things. How do you allocate resources with such diametrically opposed and kind of, stymied policy decisions in government? The allocation of resources, whether it be towards cyber security or whether it be towards health and medical or other things, or whether it be towards understanding human behavior or fostering the opportunity for people to stay in this country and continue to contribute from the education they've received in this country. How do you foresee that challenge in the future?
So for panelists that want to jump in, we've got about 12 minutes left, so try to keep our answer snappy so we can take as many questions as we can.
It's government funding. Huh?
Whoever wants to jump in.
No, but Vijay was at OSTP more recently than I was, so I thought he would get to take it. So it is a great question, it is a great challenge. As more and more of world affairs become national security concerns, there is an inclination to include them in the national security strategy process. And we've seen that in recent years. We've seen in some cases, the paralysis of decision making because of that. But you still have to have an attempt to make a strategy that are based upon the greatest risks, the greatest needs, the greatest gaps, and invest in that regard. And there's a lot of processes that do that. At OSTP, the PCAST, President's Council Advisor of Science and Technology, continue to build, make recommendations in this regard. The national strategies that I mentioned are followed up with operational implementations which have policy, technology, R&D, and capabilities needs. And all of the government resources to match a strategy get put into that process to try to prioritize R&D and spending in that regard. It's not ideal, but it's what we do, and we're doing more and more of it now on the national security front.
I'll just add a quick, snappy comment to his comment. So I think there are two pieces to it, and OSTP under President Obama's leadership actually rose to the challenge, I think. So one is, what policy can you formulate to ensure that better technology is developed and more science is done, And then the second piece is the flip side, right? So what technology and science issues need to be studied so you can formulate better policy? Climate change, cybersecurity, these are great examples of that. And I think both these things need to happen, and that's a role that the government ought to and should play.
We had a question over here. Oh, we have a microphone coming.
Okay. Resonate with the idea that we need to come down from the federal government and really empower communities and empower networks to, if they see something, they say something. But that's a little late in the game. So those people have already planned, and we are seeing something now. So really going back from that, what could be done to actually empower the communities by giving them resources, giving them best practices to actually develop the good side, the positive side, the community involvement side rather than the terrorist side. So I'd like you to comment on what should be done. It's really policies, it's resources, but what else in terms of health and education and so forth to empower the community to do something way ahead of time?
That's a great question. So there's two parts of that, is what do we do way ahead of time that we can do, and what are we not doing that we need to do more of? The empowering communities was a national strategy, is a national strategy, and is the approach we have today. And the way it works is the law enforcement community and the intelligence community provide communities now with threat briefings. Here's how your kids are getting recruited, or here's what they're looking online at today. Be aware of this. Here are some counter tools you can use. Here are some ways in which you can engage law enforcement or others in your community to identify at-risk, let's call them youth, young folks, before they go down to the dark side. What's missing, and I think something I would like to see more of, I call it off-ramps, right? We don't know if somebody is going to become a terrorist. The preponderance of individuals who may have, some interest in or some resonance with the terrorism never become terrorists, never operationalize. They just have those thoughts. How do you get the folks who are possibly going to go away with it? In my view, the answer is that there's a lot of folks who have angst in their teenage and 20s and things like that. We don't know whether they're going to become criminals. We don't know how to become successful folks. But as a community, we can help those who are going down paths which may be problematic by providing them off-ramps, sports opportunities, job opportunities. But you have to identify them first. And they do this in Belgium very well. It didn't show when they had their attacks, but they have some very interesting programs right now to help identify those who are possibly, and maybe they're going to become a criminal, not a terrorist. Or maybe they're just going to do poorly in school, or they're just having social alienation issues. Okay, we can still, as a community, try to support those individuals by providing off-ramps, and we need to identify those earlier.
In the front?
Good morning.
It's okay.
Thank you very much for your perspectives. I was curious, since you've noted the urbanization trend around the world, what our national security policy does with regard to systematically looking at the urban issues of national security in the 4 areas you were talking about.
Okay, so the framework that I set out front, what is the mission of Homeland Security? Borders, immigration, cyber, resilience, and terrorism. In the first quadrennial review, the first strategy we had, and frankly, the first time somebody wrote a national document in 2003, I think it was, about Homeland Security, the notion was that this is fundamentally different, that we have to work with our cities and our communities. This is a law enforcement problem happening at the city communities. Now, for many, many years, we talked about the away game and just worrying about folks abroad, using our tools of national security, our military and our intelligence. But at the city and community level, on counterterrorism, on resilience to natural disasters and other attacks, that is done at the local level through grant programs, looking at risk equations. So there's annual programs that have been going on for a decade plus that does every city and community of some size, and there's thousands of them across the United States, does an annual risk assessment. And they look at the threats that we just talked about, and they say, how bad is it for my community? How vulnerable am I, and what are the possible consequences? And based upon that, make a submission usually to FEMA, which operates the grants at the city and community level. And now this year, and last year, looking at cyber risks, and they get, based upon the highest risk, they do a prioritization, and the cities get grant funding from the federal government that way, and state and local too.
That's not my question.
I'm sorry.
Homeland Security is thinking about cities and the enormous issues we've had with infrastructure.
That is a Homeland Security. So that's the framework. When I sat at my desk as the head of policy at the Department of Homeland Security, I worked with Craig Fugate, who's the head of FEMA, to establish priorities. How do you figure out what the risks are? We have risk equations. And we sent this out, guidance out to cities and communities, thousands of them, that they come back on an annual basis. There is a whole national preparedness paradigm that was implemented over 5 or so years, starting in 2011, 3 years, that does this bottom-up approach, looking at the risks in each community, whether it's climate, severe weather, whether it's terrorism, cyber now, and asks them to evaluate that. We help them, federal government helps them do the evaluation and the analysis, and then based upon the highest risks and concern, there are grants that go out to these communities. That's what the federal government does, working very closely with state and local governments. They also work with fusion centers, which are state and local intelligence operations. They get national and international threat information, and they fuse it with local law enforcement information to have a better understanding of what's happening in their communities that may be linked to warnings and indicators, terrorism, cyber attacks, aviation threats, et cetera. And that happens now in over 120 fusion centers in the country, around the country, I believe.
All right, we have time for only one more question, unfortunately, in the second row there.
Thank you very much. My question between Professor Kumar and Mr. David, you both spoke of the acceleration of technology. Now, the acceleration of technology is due to competition. What do you think if we replace competition with cooperation? If we replace competition with cooperation instead of competing with China and competing with Europe, with Germany, with all people, with our technology competition, if we start cooperate with those people, what we will not need to accelerate that inefficient proliferation of technology. And I wonder, my second small question to Professor Kumar, I wonder if we will ever see a cooperation between China and India on how to accommodate for such a huge economic concentration, how to accommodate how to provide for so many people peacefully, how to make them happy, feed them well, even if they will not have jobs.
So in terms of, so I think, again, we have to distinguish between basic R&D, technological innovation on one side, and then what takes that and creates jobs and socioeconomic opportunities. I think the former piece, I think this is already happening. Most of us in the science and technology business really don't worry about geopolitical boundaries unless the Department of Commerce says you can't do X. For example, in the space of drones, this is a big issue. Mm-hmm. To give you an example, we have a new innovation campus that President Gutman is going to inaugurate in October. The Pennovation campus will have companies from China, companies from Japan that are interested. So I think this kind of collaboration is already happening. The question of whether two political arch enemies would actually collaborate or not is hard to hard to speculate on. But certainly at this S&T level, the science and technology level, it already happens. I think the other thing is also linked to, I think, our immigration policies. You know, it's funny, if you look at the business of taking technology and creating and having socioeconomic impact, that activity really does not respect geographical and political boundaries, I believe. So unless governments interfere in this, I know about India, I know about China, I know about the US, oftentimes I think governments will, if they see opportunities, they try to facilitate these things. Of course, then the question of can they do it fast enough comes back to, you know, in the context of this pace of technology change, the question of governments can react fast enough is still an open question. But I'm encouraged in what I see, except in areas such as cybersecurity and in the area of drones. And there are a whole host of other areas where the Department of Commerce in the US will restrict what kinds of interactions can happen.
Let me take the second question, and that is cooperation between India and China. I've worked closely with both countries in this regard. China and India just last year had a very successful high-level state visit. Prime Minister Modi has gone around the world, but particularly to China, because of the tremendous resources that India is looking for investing in their cities to deal with their economic growth, to deal with their climate concerns, to deal with public health and public safety. And they need tremendous amount of investment, and they have now burgeoning great cooperation with China, specifically to invest in Indian cities, number one. Number two, would you like to guess the number one and number two largest number of foreign students getting educated in this country and elsewhere? It's India and China, and they're doing it together. So forget geopolitics. The students are working together in campuses here, across the United States and the world right now, and there's a diplomatic element of that, which has remnants going back to the Cold War. It's science diplomacy, and it's part of the cooperation equation that you mentioned.
Great. Well, I hope you'll join me in doing two things before we break for coffee. The first, thanking the panelists. The second, before we break for coffee, is I want to take just 2 minutes to explain to you why we had a panel about this. And the reason relates to what Zeke Emanuel mentioned before, which is the second floor of Perry Worldhouse, the Global Innovation Program, the research arm of Perry Worldhouse, which will amplify and focus our global engagement. One of our inaugural research themes is actually around an area called the Future of the Global Order, Power, Technology, and Governance. And in this area, we'll basically be exploring three things. You may not be surprised to hear: power, technology, and governance. Power, by that we mean everything from things like Russia's invasion of Crimea, more traditional forms of military power, as well as cultural power, economic influence. Technology, looking at both the upsides and downsides of emerging technologies and how they intersect with everything else that's going on in the world. In governance, in thinking about how international institutions will handle all the diverse questions we talked about today, as well as deal with systematic, long-term issues such as climate change. And we think that with the academic expertise at the University of Pennsylvania, from politics, law, engineering, medicine, history and sociology and science, and elsewhere, that we're really well poised to make a difference in the global arena in these areas and become a thought leader and fulfill the vision of Perry Worldhouse. We're running a series of workshops this year, including on rising powers in international law, on emerging technologies in global politics, and on investor risk in the developed and developing world. We also have a series of visitors coming this year, including Lady Cathy Ashton, the former High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy for the European Union, this guy right here, Mike Boyle, an Associate Professor of Political Science down the road at LaSalle, Jared Cohen, the president of Jigsaw, formerly Google Ideas, from the State Department Policy Planning staff, and Tom Wright, a distinguished foreign policy thought leader at the Brookings Institution. So I'm going to wrap up by saying we are so excited that you're here today, and we're looking forward to interacting with you over the next few years on this theme, the future of the global order. Thank you.
To Mike and our panel, I'd invite you to join us all for coffee and refreshments. We'll reconvene at 11 to turn our attention to the refugee crisis in Europe.